Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm Charina Garcia, and I'm the Strategy and Immigration Partner here at WR Immigration. I'm joined here with Charlie Oppenheim, and he leads our government relations group. He was the chief of the State Department's Visa Control Unit for 23 years, where he directed the numerically controlled immigrant visas. This is my fifth Chatting with Charlie webinar, where we'll pick up from our last webinar. Our last webinar, we actually didn't have the April Visa Bulletin. So this webinar, we're actually going to be discussing the April and May Visa Bulletins. I'm also joined today with Laura. She's our senior associate, and she's going to also discuss the top of mind topics that we have for our global mobility managers. Again, just our legal disclaimer, this does not constitute legal advice, informational purposes only. We welcome you to schedule a consultation with one of our attorneys should you have any questions about this presentation. This also will be on our YouTube channel, so you can follow us on our YouTube channel if you'd like to see the prior Chatting with Charlie. And then just a little bit of information about our firm. We are one of the top-rated immigration firms. We provide high-touch service, and we have an incredible technology solution that we use to augment our clients' global mobility programs. Again, I'm Charina Garcia. I'm the Strategy Innovation Partner based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have Charlie as well.
Good morning or afternoon.
And then we have Laura.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
So we'll kick it off. We have a lot to talk about. So we're going to talk about the April Visa Bulletin, which was released after our last webinar. So it was released very late, in late March. And then the May Visa Bulletin, which also came out, our predictions, and then what is going on with the Visa Bulletin. How do we determine dates? And then the employment limits and the otherwise unused visa numbers. So with that, we'll start off with the trends and what we're seeing. So this chart shows you all chargeability, EB1, 2, 3, from September through May, and then China, EB1, 2, 3, September through May, and then India, EB1, 2, 3, September through May. And so Charlie, I've been getting a lot of questions and calls about what's going on with the Visa Bulletin. So can you kind of walk us through what's going on with the dates and what movement we've seen, or what non-movement or retrogression we've seen?
Sure, and I would like to say that even though we didn't have the April Bulletin at the time of our last discussion, many of the predictions which we made last month, once the April Bulletin was published, proved to be correct. So, you know, retrogressions are sometimes unavoidable at certain times in the year. But I guess the question many are asking is, why are they occurring so frequently this year and often in back-to-back months? And for that, I don't really have a good answer. It typically, you try to avoid retrogressions. And when you were to retrogress a date, typically when I was doing it, I would try to do it as, you know, the type of thing you pull the Band-Aid off so fast so it hurts one time. So I would typically try to establish a retrogress date at a point where it could be held maybe for many months, but at some point, hopefully the date could begin to advance at some point and not have several retrogressions within the same fiscal year. In terms of the in terms of all chargeability areas, we have seen back-to-back retrogressions in the employment second preference and the establishment of a date in the third preference rest of world category. Again, I would hope that the third preference date which they established is sufficient, and maybe they, at worst case, they will hold that date. And in an ideal world, maybe it could, if demand subsides somewhat, maybe they could begin advancing it. I think there's, you know, we will want to continue watching the second since it has had back-to-back. People may want to start watching that. China, with the dates, seem to be in much better shape. We've had either the holding of the date in the employment first and second preference, And for 2 months in a row, we've seen third preference number use advance for China, which is an excellent sign. For the China employment first preference, I think that in June or July, there's an excellent chance that that date will retrogress. I think that it could retrogress to a date as early as September 1st of 2021. With the EB2 date, I think that it may begin to move a week or so at a time, hopefully. And the same with the China third preference. Might get lucky to have a month at a time movement there in the coming months. With India third preference, or excuse me, India first preference, as with China, I believe that the India first preference date will retrogress in either June or July. And again, as with China, it would, I think, as early as September 1st of 2021. I think that there's a chance that the employment second preference will retrogress. And I think that the India employment second could retrogress to as early as July 1st of 2010. I think that the third preference date is likely to hold. And I'm not sure, because of the establishment of an employment third preference rest of world date, for the time being, I would not expect any further advancement of the India third preference date. Hopefully that would change. One thing I would, kind of observe with the India dates is the dates which have been in effect for India second preference all of this fiscal year were also in effect throughout fiscal year 2022. And last year they used over 55,000 India employment second preference numbers. So it's a little bit confusing as to why, with so many visa numbers being used last year, why there has been so much required retrogression in the India second preference date this year. We've had 3 retrogressions already of India second, with a 4th predicted.
So basically, the numbers that were there in effect in 2022, they're bringing it back again now. Is that what you're saying? These are the similar numbers from 2022 that we saw?
Well, all of these dates were in effect last year. So any India second preference applicant that has been subject to these dates this year could have been processed to conclusion and received a visa last year. And again, over 55,000 India second preference numbers were used last year when the date advanced to December 1st of 2014. So why are there so many Indian second preference applicants still with 2011 or 2012 dates, which are requiring these retrogressions?
I think that's a very good question. We can move to the next slide and let's talk about it. So let's talk about the volatility of the visa bulletin. So Charlie, can you talk to us? What's the state of the USCIS statistical data?
When I left, it was in very good shape. In fact, I was kind of envious of the data that they were starting to provide and wished that I had had access to it earlier. And again, the data that over the last two plus years that I was chief had been improving dramatically, and they were, again, having better capability to derive the data. And there was good exchange from USCIS and my office. So I can't say whether that is continuing or the reliability of the data which is being provided at this point. The retrogressions would of the dates, and so many would call into question, if I were looking at this objectively, I'd have to say, is the data on which Department of State is making these final action date determinations, is it sufficient to do so?
Yeah, so just my suspicion and what I've been seeing is that, you imagine it's supposed to be first in, first out, right? So if they move the dates, then they're going to process those in those priority dates who have those dates or earlier, right? But what I've been seeing is last in, first out, meaning that some of my clients who actually have filed later are actually getting their green cards approved versus my clients who filed before and have been sitting in the AOS queue for a long time. So I'm not sure what's going on there with the USCIS and what sort of method they're using to actually process cases, but just from what I've seen, and Laura, I think you've seen the similar as well, where we have cases that have been sitting for 2 to 3 years, and then all of a sudden, an older case we just filed, a newer case that we just filed gets approved within a year.
Yeah, agreed. We're seeing the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that coupled with the early dates that we're experiencing now in India second would suggest that last fiscal year, more of the more recently filed cases were being processed to conclusion at the quote expense of those who had filed years earlier and maybe being processed now. It's interesting. I glanced at the India second preference category final action dates, and during the last 8 years I was chief, the India second preference date only retrogressed 3 times in 8 years. It's already retrogressed 3 times this fiscal year, with a 4th predicted.
Yeah, I think it's probably very difficult right now with the backload of petitions that are there and the manner in which USCIS is processing it. And that's my prediction. Like, that's why the dates keep moving. I also think perhaps that is a reason why rest of world has actually had a cutoff, because perhaps they had been processing more of the more backlog cases like EB2, India, China, instead of the rest of world cases. And perhaps that's why all of a sudden we have a backlog. But then again, I'm not Charlie. I didn't work for the Department of State for 23 years. So I'm just kind of hypothesizing just from a common sense sort of perspective.
I think I would have to agree with you to a large extent. And also, a newly filed case is typically going to be much easier to adjudicate than one filed many years earlier, where they may need updated information, etc. So if USCIS and the State Department need to be applauded on the fact that they were able to use virtually every available visa number in the employment categories last fiscal year and did clear out a large number of cases. So, they did their best to maximize number use and achieve their goal.
No, I completely agree. Time will only tell how we're going to see everything normalize and perhaps the Visa Bulletin actually stop being so volatile. But I think for now, it is going to be this volatility, and we're just going to have to, wait every mid-month to see what's coming up next. So, Charlie, what's the USCIS agenda like? When do they actually provide the data to Department of State?
Typically at the end of each month. When I was there, and I'm assuming it still continues, we would have discussions with key officers at the Immigration Service. They would provide data on the amount of cases that they had pending at the National Benefits Center, how many cases had been forwarded to the field for final action if an interview were required, and we had to rely heavily on the suggestions of USCIS in the movement of the employment final action dates, because USCIS uses, if you take away the 5th preference, USCIS probably uses 90% of the employment numbers. So you have to rely more heavily on their data versus the data that their State Department's own data from the National Visa Center. But again, the data was provided typically at the very beginning of the month, and then it was used in the determination of the dates. And we would try to typically do that on or about the 8th of each month, depending on whether that was a weekend or not, so that we could get the dates posted on the travel.state.gov website as quickly as possible.
Okay, and then how does experience, historical perspective inform DOS Visa Bulletin? Like what factors or what are you looking at?
Well, what you would have to do is look at, okay, historically, if I moved the date a week and it was 500 applicants, is it likely to be 500 applicants again the coming month based on new filings? Are there certain times of the year when the adjustment of status and visas number use overseas is higher? Are you learning from that there may be any processing or staffing issues which may impact processing either at an overseas post or the immigration service? And you would take much of that information into consideration when you're making the determination of the monthly dates. And that may make you advance the dates at a quicker pace if you know that later in the year that the workload may or staffing may impact workload and production, or maybe you would hold it off and you know that, okay, there's not enough staffing at this time, but there will be later on, so we'll wait to move the dates till then.
So I know we don't cover family base here, but we get a lot of questions about family base. So can you just kind of summarize real quickly what's going on with family base, and specifically a lot of questions about F2B for the unmarried adult children of permanent residents?
Sure. Although the rest of world dates had been held for a considerable amount of time, and basically that's because I had advanced them so quickly during the COVID time to try to maximize number use then, that as the State Department, which typically does about 95% of the family processing, State Department's been recovering from post closures during the COVID times. So I think they've kind of waded through all that backlog, and now they're moving the dates in an attempt to maximize number of use this year and try to generate number use and demand for the next fiscal year. So I think that family-based applicants in the first, 2B, third, and fourth can see some continued forward movement during the remainder of the year, with the exception of the F2A category. I think that it seems that the demand there has increased dramatically. And so that I wouldn't offer a projection of whether the F2A may be moving. To your point with 2B category, I think it's interesting that both the family first and the family 2B application filing dates are now the same. So I think that may bode or may mean that at some point the F1 and F2B dates may be fairly close, much closer than they are now.
Yeah, so I'm Filipino, so we're always carved out in the Philippines section, and so we're always waiting a long time. So I think it's a big change, I think, for a lot of the people who are not born in the Philippines or Mexico to actually have to wait longer than what the Mexico and Philippines has had to wait for. So he's giving some good news. He thinks there actually will be some movement, but unfortunately we're not sure about first F1 or F2B, right? It may be similar. So
right. I think the dates are going to be fairly close.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll move to the next slide. And then so how are the final action dates determined each month? So Charlie's going to walk through some examples with us, which is really helpful. And I think you'll learn a lot from these examples he's providing.
Right. And for the examples, we're going to start off on the premise that at the very beginning of the year, the State Department determines that they want to use an equal amount of numbers in each month, which is not the way it works. Typically, you try to have the number use more heavily in the first 8 months, and then with it less in the final 4, so that you can kind of ease into to the maximum, the annual limit, instead of having a big rush. But for these examples, we'll say that the category X, the annual limit's 2,400, which would be 200 numbers a month. And the final action date when we start out the year is already established to January 15th, 2014.
Okay, so let's go to our examples.
So
So this one, steady use of Visa numbers.
yes, so we're at any given point in the year, we're 7 months into the year, so we've used 1,400 numbers, which is exactly where we want to be. We wanted to use 200 numbers a month. 7 months in, we've used 1,400. So we expect that we'll be able to continue using 200 numbers a month. So we would want to establish a date as close that would allow that about that many numbers to be used. In this example, what you're looking at, this chart, this is almost identical to what the State Department is looking at on their screens when they're making the determination of the dates. They have this report, and they have another report that's been provided by USCIS based on demand, which is pending at their National Benefits Center or been sent to the field. So there's two reports. This is one of the primary ones. So here, what they would do is they want to use 200 numbers. They would try to establish a date that would be as close to that point. And there's 190 applicants with priority dates before January 15th, 2014. So they would hold the existing final action date.
Okay, so 43 with prior dates through 2013. And then the next month, they have another 62 with priority dates before January 1, 2014. So now we're at 105 total applicants. And then the following month, January 8, 2014, folks who have a priority date before that, 85, and that's how we hit the 190, right?
Exactly. So
Okay.
so those first column of figures are the amount of applicants with priority dates in that weekly grouping, and then the
Okay.
cumulative total.
So you're gonna hold it at
So,
January 15, 2014.
right. So for the 8th month through the end of the year, they would project that they would be holding. So then we'd go to the next.
Okay,
So through the 7 months, they look and they've figured out that they have used actually 1,150 numbers, which is 250 that fewer than they wanted to use through 7 months. So they say for the next remaining months, they have to up the number used to 250 a month to reach their goal of using all 2,400 numbers. So again, they would look on the chart and they would try to establish a date that allows as close to 250 applicants to be issued visas in the next month. And they would look down here, they go to 264. That would allow them to advance the final action date to February 1st, 2014, and potentially those 264 people would be issued visas or adjust status in the US.
okay. So this is where they actually advance the dates. The prior
Correct.
slide was where they hold the date. So don't
Holding the date.
forget. This slide is about advancing the date. Now we're going to go to our slide about the overuse, and this is what we call retrogression, right?
Yes, and this would be an example of why the India dates or the rest of world date or any date has retrogressed. They had their target and they look and they see that they've already used 2,125 numbers, which is 725 more than they wanted to use at this point in the year. So they realize, okay, for the remaining months in the year, if we want to continue issuing an equal amount, we have to reduce the allocation to 55 and keep number use within the 2,400 limit. Therefore, they would go to the same chart that they had before, and they would look and say, okay, we can only do 43 applicants. That means we have to retrogress the date back to January 1st of 2014. So this would be a retrogression of the final action date.
Okay, so this is where we're seeing things moving backwards, and you said
Backwards.
in this year, they've already moved some categories back 3 times.
Correct. And all these other people would be, down to the 899 figure. The remaining, those people would have to be waiting for potential movement of the final action date at some point in the future. And when that may occur, it would be based on revised monthly targets.
So these dates, when you put 43, 62, is this Department of State and USCIS grouping?
To a large extent, the State Department, the National Visa Center reports to the visa office on a monthly basis how many applicants are documentarily complete in categories by country and are ready to go depending on the new month's final action date. The Immigration Service would also be processing cases, and they request numbers as the officer is ready to finalize action on the case, and they submit a request on a daily basis to the visa office. And if their request for the applicant's case is within the applicable final action date, then they get an immediate response saying authorization granted. They can print that piece of paper out, stick it in the applicant's file, and ship it off to get a green card produced. If it's beyond the final action date, the information is held at the State Department, and that applicant's priority date information would be reflected in these totals. And then whenever the final action date did advance enough, the Immigration Service would be emailed an authorization, which they could then marry up with the applicant's case file and again get a green card produced. But again, this would be a kind of a combination of State Department and immigration totals.
But isn't that kind of the wild card then? Because if you know from the NVC side, these are this many people with a priority date through 2013 of 43, but then the USCIS is requesting a number based on usage as they come along, then you really have, it's hard to predict, in my opinion, because you don't know if all of a sudden they have all these EB3 downgrades that they're processing, and then all of a sudden you thought you had only 43, but then it goes up to 100.
Exactly, and this is what could produce the overuse of number. You may have been making projections and then more demand is coming in. But as we mentioned earlier, this is one of those historical perspectives that you would do based on historical knowledge. You might estimate, okay, or based on your discussions with the Immigration Service, that they expect a higher amount of people to be processed in the coming month. And you take that into consideration when you're establishing the final action date and how many numbers you actually want to use.
Well, you bring back some history here. And I remember when I was at an AILA conference way back when, and the Visa Bulletin came out and everything was current. And we're like, what are they doing here in this Department of State? And then we had a mad rush to file. Do you remember that year, Charlie?
Yes, it was for the month of July 2007, I made all of the employment categories current, and that was based on discussions we had held with the USCIS during a monthly ombudsman's meeting, at which time I was asked, how many numbers do you need to use between now and the end of the fiscal year in order to reach the limits? I said a figure. The USCIS ombudsman then asked immigration, do you have enough demand to reach that total? They said no. And because they said no, and the demand did not exceed the amount of numbers available, I made everything current. Then subsequently, we were flooded with demand, which required then the reestablishment of dates.
So that's the prior slide that we were looking at, the one where
Yes.
there is a lot of, there's underusage of numbers. And so in 2007, you said?
Yeah, it was July of 2007.
Like
All of
16 years ago.
all of the employment categories went current because we, at the time, if I remember correctly, we needed to use in the July through September, we needed to use in the range of 70,000 numbers, which was approximately the same amount which had been used during the first 8 months of the year.
Yeah, so
So-
that was in June, we got the announcement. And so it was just a crazy mad rush. Laura, you're too young to remember all of this, but I've been practicing for 25 years. So I still remember that crazy time where we didn't sleep and clients were just coming in and we were just filing adjustments. So that's a different story. We'll cover that next month. So next slide. All right. So the initial per country limit and additional otherwise unused numbers. We're going to go through this with India. So can you kind of walk us through these charts and what we're looking at here?
Sure. And typically, there are otherwise unused numbers under the worldwide limit. For example, if the worldwide first preference limit were 80,000 and India and China were only going to use, or the rest of world was determined that they were not going to use all of the numbers available to them, then any unused numbers under the annual limit can be provided in priority date order, with typically, depending on the category, numbers are made available to either China and or India. This allowed, you can see in recent years, although the limits were much lower, that India first preference received far more numbers than they were eligible for under the normal first preference annual limit. The same thing would be for second preference. You can see that they used far more numbers than were available in the normal second preference limit. For India second, you see 5636 was the limit. They were able to use 15,801 numbers that were otherwise available from second preference. Plus, they benefited by the fall down of also unused employment first preference numbers, ultimately allowing India's second preference to use approximately 59,000 numbers last fiscal year versus their quote per country limit of 5636. So the use of otherwise numbers provides a great benefit to countries which have already reached their per country limit. I do not think that that will be the case for India's second preference this fiscal year. I think as long as there is a rest of world employment second preference final action date, I think India's second preference number use will be limited to approximately 3,944. And that is being reflected on the retrogressions of the India second date. They're trying to prevent India's second preference number use from going over that 3,944 total.
So, but for first preference, you think there'll be any otherwise unused numbers for EB1 India?
Yes, I think that that's what's already allowed. Although there was an India first preference date established, I think that they're going to use far more than the 3,900 numbers. I think that because if there were to be a increased number use in first preference on a rest of world basis, which it does appear there is, I think that their number use would be limited, but I still think that India first will probably use in approximately 13,000 numbers for 2023. You know, maybe 10 to 13 or 14,000.
Okay, and then for 2024, these are all just estimated, right?
Yeah, I still think that for 2024, the India first preference will use a significant amount of first preference numbers based on the availability of otherwise unused numbers. But in the India second preference, if there continues to be a rest of world second preference final action date, then India second would be limited to that estimated 3,003 figure. And that is what's going to potentially limit future movement of the India second preference date as we enter into fiscal 2024.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is about our employment-based annual limits, and this is what we're seeing now, right?
Yeah, and you will see this, in the COVID years for 2021, 2022, and we're still recovering, benefiting by the unused family numbers that fell across. There's been 3 years in a row where there are record high annual limits. The normal minimum limit is 140,000. I think, and I'm estimating that for fiscal 2024, that based on increased family number use, the employment limit will be reduced to approximately 150,000, maybe several thousand lower. So we're not going to see as many numbers in the first, second, and third preference available on a worldwide and a per country limit basis as we've experienced in previous years.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is an example of the determination of otherwise unused immigrant visa numbers. So can you walk us through this example?
Sure, and this is an example using the fiscal 2020 second preference limit, which was approximately 80,511. Excuse me. The normal per country limit would have been 5636. State would have known that India was going to use all those numbers. They would also know that China had enough demand to use all the numbers. Then they would estimate how many numbers they thought were going to be used by rest of world applicants, and they estimated, say, 40,239. They would subtract those 3 figures from the overall limit, and it would come out to 29,000. So they would know, okay, we're going to have 29,000 otherwise unused numbers under the EB2 annual limit. Those numbers could then be made available to any country, being India or China, who had already reached their annual limit. And those numbers are made available strictly in priority date order. Therefore, the 29,000 basically would have gone all to Indian employment second preference applicants.
But because we have a cutoff for EB2, all other, all chargeability, what is it going to look like, you think? For
Well, they're estimating now that they're not going to have any unused rest of world numbers. So what the reason, so by that fact, that's evident by the fact that they've imposed a worldwide second preference date. That means there's not going to be any unused numbers. So this year, the India second preference per country limit use and China per country limit use plus the rest of the world is going to hit the applicable limit, which I believe is in previous slide shows around 52,000. So they're saying there are no otherwise unused numbers, and that's what's hurting the India second preference final action date this year.
Yeah, and if they think that, then we probably won't even see any movement, right, between now and September.
No, I think the fact that they have retrogressed and are saying we're going to retrogress it again is they're saying we think there's already enough demand for India second either have used or potentially will use within whatever date we have established, May through September, to limit the number used to the India per country limit. So this does not bode well for India second preference going forward.
Or China, right?
Or China as well. China's in a little bit better shape. I think that the demand with old dates is a little bit less. So potentially India or China second may see some movement of that final action date.
Okay, but probably India.
India's not in good shape.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We can go to the next slide. All right, Laura, talk to us.
Yes.
How long do we think it will take from the perm application filing, which is when you lock in your priority date, to the adjustment of status filing based on the May Visa Bulletin? So these are our predictions, not Charlie's. These are just Laura and our predictions based on data that we've actually looked at in our internal database, right, Laura?
Yeah, so these are from our current indicators. So I think, again, this is like a best case scenario, what we can expect from the May Visa Bulletin. I think the biggest takeaway I have from the May Visa Bulletin for our clients is, as it relates to rest of world, you're seeing second and third preference category backlogs, and that if DOL processing were faster, these folks would experience a longer backlog. Right now, we've talked in previous months about how long Department of Labor processing is taking. So, 7 to 9 months to receive a prevailing wage request, 8 to 10 months to receive a perm certification. If those timelines were lower, folks from rest of world and EB2 or EB3 would have a longer backlog. But so it's they're sort of in a shorter Visa Bulletin backlog because they're in a longer Department of Labor processing line.
So basically you're saying they can't actually establish their priority date until 10 months when they start their perm application,
Correct.
right? So if it's going to take 10 months to file my perm and I don't lock in my priority dates until 10 months later, so maybe it'll be, January of 2024, right? So, but
Right.
if I have an older priority date from my prior employer, the chances of me getting through and getting a number is it's actually better, right? It's higher, right? But
Yeah.
then when you factor in the layoffs that are happening, right? And then the folks that aren't actually able to file their perm application because of the layoffs, right? Then that's also going to impact it as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
Exactly.
your priority date's not going to be established until when your employer can actually file your perm application. And we've heard that some employers have actually suspended their perm program because they can't actually submit perm applications because there are qualified US workers to do the job due to the layoffs.
Right. Yeah. Some big tech clients just cannot file perms for several months. So when you say that they've suspended it, it's because they can't possibly proceed under compliance rules with the DOL. So that's my takeaway for rest of world. And again, some of these numbers here, this is based on what we've seen clients processing. So these are current indicators. Of course, they can change. And so we're calling this a best case scenario for Chinese born and Indian born EB2 and EB3 applicants.
Yeah, so I've actually seen from when Charlie said 2007, when he made everything current, I think I had one client where it took about 14, 15 years before his date became current and he got his green card. So, that was like the worst case scenario. But I see for you in India, EB2, we're predicting about 6 to 11 years best case scenario. But then again, for my particular client, it took about 14 years, so 15 years. Go to the next slide. All right, so can you help explain this slide to us?
So yeah, we took a look at our data from AOS cases filed in 2020 through 2022. How long was it taking from the time the adjustment of status was filed to the time they received the green card? And so on average, that was over a year. Of course, there were outliers. And the outliers really for the maximum is when that foreign nationals priority date saw retrogression. So as we were discussing earlier, there's been a ton of volatility in the EB2 and EB3 India category. And so what we've seen is our clients being able to file their adjustment of status case, but then the date retrogressed, moved forward, moved back. And so that's the story for some of those maximum timeframes. The minimum, again, was what Charina was mentioning a little bit earlier, that we've sort of seen last in, first out. So some of these folks who've been able to file got very, very quick turnaround times, whereas some of our other clients who had been pending for a long time still sort of sat stagnant. That the joke we have is that USCIS has some back room somewhere with a ton of applications that they forgot about. And sometimes if you're feeling frustrated or your company is feeling frustrated with some of your employees not getting their cases moving forward, it's unclear to us why some cases just aren't moving forward. And we're seeing a pretty big disparity in case processing timeframes.
But I don't want people to get the idea, because I don't want people calling me and saying, you said that it could take only 90 days for my adjustment to be approved because that's that 103, Laura. So those
Yeah.
are the outliers. We call those the very, very, very lucky people that, you know, you're super lucky because many times, like 99% of the time, it really is the 1 year plus processing time.
Right. And again, I think, you know, some folks that have been able to file, but then saw retrogression might still be pending. So there's plenty of clients that we have that were able to file in 2021 because there was the big movement forward in EB2 India category, and then we've seen that pull back. So those folks are still sitting in queue, or I've even had clients with a EB3 India with a 2013 priority date that got an interview, but they're not going to get approved until final action moves forward again, which again is not likely to be anytime soon.
Yeah, and I have the sad story of twin boys born in India, right? And one
Right.
boy gets the green card because they were able to get the number from Department of State, but the second boy doesn't get it because it retrogresses all of a sudden when they request the number, I guess, Charlie, from Department of State. So you have a whole family where the father, the mother, one twin boy has a green card, and then there's one little boy who's left behind and he's sitting there in the retrogression.
It's such an
Right,
extreme story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
it happens.
I can tell you, I would get calls when they're from the service, but the case would get split up, and sometimes, like you said, the two children's file would get separated, and a request would be made for one, and the others. We would even see it some rare occasion where a principal, where the children would and the spouse would get their request approved, but they forgot to submit the principal because they were, you know, 4 different files that were being processed at different times.
Yeah, so those are the sad situations. So we tell them now, file F2A, like go file F2A because you might have a better chance under F2A. So that's what we're advising our clients now, is because the father is a green card holder and F2A dates for filing is current. And so we're saying perhaps you might want to think about doing an I-130 for your child now and see which is faster. Okay, next slide. All right, we have 10 minutes for questions. So this is the interesting question. Okay, these are our EB2 upgrade downgrade situation. So what's the impact of an EB2 to EB3 porting on EB1 wait times? So Laura, do you want to explain that one?
I'll take a stab at it, sure. So when someone's downgrading from EB2 to EB3 to take advantage of right now what is a better priority date in India EB3, that's not going to impact the EB1 category. So the EB1 category is still going to have the same processing times. What we discussed a couple of months ago was we're seeing, because the wait time's so long and career progressions, we're seeing folks with 2012 priority dates from EB2 established become EB1 for maybe they took a rotation abroad or whatever it might be, and that's going to impact EB1 times. But the mere porting between EB2 and EB3 does not impact priority dates or wait time for EB1.
Yeah. So what she's basically saying is you could go from EB2 downgrade to EB3, and then if you get offered a job to go overseas and you're managing a team for a year, then you're coming back to manage a team here, then you could probably do EB1, right? Then you can improve your waiting period, but otherwise there's really no change.
Right. So it's only if you're moving to EB1, and we're seeing some of that happen because, again, these wait times have been so long. Some folks have that opportunity within their international organization to manage abroad and come back.
Yeah. So 90% of the backlog for consular visa processing is due to 20 countries. What is being done to eliminate such backlog in those posts? Charlie, do you have an idea about this question?
Yeah, I know when I left, the consular affairs #1 priority was to try to reduce and eliminate the backlogs which had been generated because of the COVID issues. It is important to remember that staffing will have a big impact on this. The capacity of the post. Just because the post wants to do more visas, they may not have the staffing or facilities to do this. But again, their number one goal was to try to eliminate the backlogs as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I have an example. I have a client that filed an F2A for their spouse, and she's in Pakistan. And I was told that the wait times just to get an interview in Pakistan is 2 to 3 years. So that's probably due to staffing, right?
Staffing, and it must be remembered that the State Department was impacted on the hiring of new officers, and training was impacted. So a number of things were impacted, and all that workload that would normally have been done at the second half of 2020 and throughout 2021, that kind of piled up. And so you've got all that those old cases, plus the ones that are still coming through the door. So unless there's a tremendous funding increase for the State Department in the consular affairs area, it's going to probably take a while for them to dig out from the backlog resulting from COVID issues, which are not their fault, and they have no recourse.
Yeah. So why is EB2 row a single column despite high demand from countries like South Korea that are close to hitting their country cap?
Okay, for using South Korea as an example, the South Korea would have an overall employment per country limit. And any of the South Korea fourth preference or fifth preference numbers, which are not being used under those limits, would fall up to the South Korea employment first. If not, those numbers are not all required, those numbers would then fall down to second. So Korea, the second preference, could end up having a much, much higher per country limit than the normal initial limit would have been. So, and that could be happening for any country, but South Korea is the other country which is very close to hitting their limit in the second preference.
So they may have a special cutoff?
I don't think so. I think it's highly unlikely that South Korea would have it, because this is not a new phenomenon. This has been happening for years in terms of South Korea, having high number use. People typically do not think of South Korea as a high employment number use country. They're typically thinking of India, China, and the Philippines, but South Korea uses a tremendous amount of employment numbers.
All right. So if the Department of State USCIS couldn't capture the duplicate application under the same person, how will the date movement be calculated?
It's calculated in the category in which the petition was originally approved. So if the petition was originally approved in second preference, that's where it's being counted. Even though the person may be attempting to downgrade their status, until that petition is downgraded to third, it will remain in second. Then upon approval under third, the second would disappear and it would start appearing under third.
So that's a good example of those charts we showed you about whether you hold the date, you move the date, or you retrogress the date, right? Because
and this is what's going to, although there is potential movement in the India third preference now, if lots of India second preference applicants are downgrading, that could eventually result in third preference India number use, which would slow that date movement. And the two dates may eventually get more into alignment with one another, which has been the case in earlier pre-COVID years.
Yeah. So will the EB2 date for India ever go forward?
I think the answer is yes, but when that will happen, I would think that they will try to recover from these retrogressions as quickly as possible. But I don't think you will see, I guess it got to 2014 at the end of last year. I don't think you'll see that type of date in the foreseeable future. I think it's going to take a long time to dig out and get back to that date.
Okay, so Laura, this one is for you. How long is it currently taking the DOL to process EB3 prevailing wage determinations?
So all prevailing wage determinations are taking about 7 to 9 months. And so it doesn't matter if it's an EB2 or an EB3, the DOL doesn't have different processing times for the different employment-based categories. They're generally taking about 7 to 9 months from the time you file to the Department of Labor issues that determination.
Yeah, and some outliers there we've seen are taking a year. So I had an old case that actually was just finally adjudicated and it took a year. So there are some outliers there, but the DOL has actually a good website that you can see what they're processing and or how many in their queue. Please explain when EB2 row will progress forward on Visa Bulletin. I'm not sure which, is that just all other chargeability, I guess is what they're asking?
Yeah, the rest of world, based on the fact that they've retrogressed it 2 months in a row, I do not believe that date will advance until the end of the fiscal year.
So October, we'll probably see.
There may be some movement in August or September, but the reason they've retrogressed the date is they think that the demand in the pipeline right now is sufficient to use all the numbers. If that pipeline seems to be slowing up and they determine in August or September that, hey, we are going to have more numbers available than we thought, they'll be able to advance the date at that point and still reach the annual limit. But I would, for planning purposes, I would not expect any forward movement of the rest of world date EB2 before August or September.
Okay, and then any predictions for EB2 China next year?
I think that EB2, since it has been holding steady or slowly advancing, I think you can assume slow forward movement of the India's second preference, or excuse me, China's second preference next year.
Okay.
And with the India's second preference, which there, don't remember if I mentioned it, I would not expect India's second preference forward movement until October.
Okay. And then Laura, why does USCIS say that an I-485 adjustment of status could take 50 months? It could, right?
It could. And I think the data on our previous slide from our own clients is confirming like that the maximum we said we've seen approved from 20 to 22 was 677 days.
Yeah.
So that's roughly a little over 50 months. So yes, it could take that long.
All right, well, we're at time, so we'll move along to our next slides. So again, if you want to see a demo of our technology, Rapid, we invite you to contact us, where we do a lot of predictive analytics, forecasting, and planning for our clients. Next slide. And then our next Chatting with Charlie, Charlie and Laura will join me again next month in May 24th at 11 a.m. So save the date. And with that, yeah, Laura, anything?
I was going to say, send us your questions
when
you register.
Yeah, send us your questions when you register. And with that, we'd like to thank you again for joining us on our Chatting with Charlie. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.